Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well. We are returning to Dark Souls lore this week, and I will be discussing a land that never shows itself to us visually, but enough information exists in the games to allow us to form an idea of what this land was like. That land is Carim, home to such memorable characters as Oswald the Pardoner, Lautrec the Embraced, Marvelous Chester, Aegon and his maiden Irina, along with some interesting mentioned characters such as Morn and Astor. We will also be discussing the technology that has emerged from Carim, which includes some fascinating rings and weaponry. Let's dive in and see if we can establish a refined image of Carim and understand the complexities of such a society. As is the way with many of the lands of Dark Souls, Carim is a place that is very much centered around its adherence to different faiths and gods. Like Anor Londo and other areas, the Way of White has a strong influence over Carim, but the inhabitants of this land also revere more peripheral gods of the Way of White, namely Fina, goddess of favour, and Caitha, goddess of tears. While this possibility has been put forth that Velka has an influence in Carim due to Oswald's occupation, but it's not actually known whether he became one of Velka's partners while in Carim or once he arrived in Lordran from Carim. Carim has been painted in broad strokes as a land of schemers and manipulators due to a few bad apples, but we will learn as we dig deeper that it is much more complicated than that, and Carim represents many elements of faith and chivalry that are almost absent in Lothric or Lordran. So to begin, let's take a close look at Caitha, the goddess of tears. I'm sure that almost everyone who is a fan of the Dark Souls series is familiar with the red and blue tear stone rings. The red variant of the ring allows us to become familiar with Caitha, a goddess of deep compassion, similar to Guinevere's disposition as a goddess who aids those on a valiant quest. The red tear stone ring appears in all three Dark Souls games, so let's look at the item description of each iteration. The Dark Souls 1 description reads, "This rare gem, called Tearstone, has the uncanny ability to sense imminent death. This red tearstone from Carim boosts the attack of its wearer when in danger." This initial understanding of the ring lets us know that the ring at least comes from Carim, and that the tearstone gem has a passive, sentient nature to it, allowing the wearer to strike at their enemies with renewed strength while at death's door. The description of the ring from Dark Souls 2 allows us to understand even more, which reads, "Caitha, goddess of tears, mourns the undeserving dead, shedding tears as red as blood. It is said that the stone set in this ring is one such tear." This iteration of the ring helps us to learn that the tearstone gem is actually a literal tear shed by Caitha, a goddess of Carim whose tears carry great power. This goddess seems to weep for those in danger, allowing her to act as a protector of sorts for those in mortal peril. The description of the ring from Dark Souls 3 expands upon this concept as well, which reads, "This stone is said to be a tear of mourning of the goddess Caitha, and of course tears are almost more beautiful near death." One must wonder whether these tears are shed for those that fall in the name of their goddess, or whether she only cries for one person in particular. Regardless of this, Caitha is obviously a deity that exists to help and comfort those in danger, a concept that conflicts with what seems to be the general consensus of the land of Carim up to this point. Caitha also seems to be the source of the blue tearstone rings, which increase the wearer's defense near death. They also appear in all three games, and have similar descriptions as the red rings, apart from one interesting detail from the Dark Souls 2 description, which reads, "Caitha, goddess of tears, mourns those who have lost loved ones by shedding pure tears of blue." It is said that the stone set in this ring is one such tear. It seems from this that Caitha both mourns the undeserving dead and those who have lost loved ones. However, there may be more to Caitha than meets the eye. In both Dark Souls 2 and 3, Caitha's chime can be found. In Dark Souls 2, the description reads, "Sacred chime blessed by Caitha, goddess of tears. Hex-dedicated catalyst. Cannot be used to cast miracles." Caitha, the goddess of tears, is known as a compassionate being that is with us in times of tragedy, but some believe that she is a demoness that guides us towards misfortune. So Caitha seems to be two-faced in this way. Hexes are spells that grow power from the dark, so we cannot assume that Carim is religiously based exclusively within the Way of White. The goddess seems to then garner conflicting opinions from different interpretations of her favour. The description of the chime in Dark Souls 3 allows us to understand even more about Caitha, which has a description that reads, "Sacred chime blessed by Caitha, goddess of tears, rare even among Carim clerics." Affected by intelligence, a rare thing for miracle catalysts, and also agreeable with miracles that lean towards the dark. Its existence is concealed in the name of the Archbishop, as it is anathema. This chime, as we can tell, is not standard issue to all Carim clerics. It is a rare item. This tells us that Caitha was a goddess not worshipped by all, or at least not widely available. The chime applies intelligence scaling to dark miracles, which again creates a conflict regarding whether or not Caitha is a benevolent figure or not. Let's have a look at some of the miracles associated with Caitha, which will then soon allow us to segue to Morn, another mentioned character from Dark Souls. First is Caressing Tears. Miracle taught by Morn, the Archbishop's apostle. Cures bleed, poison, and frost for self and those in the vicinity. Caressing Tears is a tale of the many deaths surrounding the goddess Caitha, of whom Morn was a known follower. From this we can gather that Caitha had a sworn follower, Morn, and that he also taught her miracles to others. We also discover that Carim had an archbishop, one that Morn was an apostle of. Now, the title and responsibilities of an archbishop have changed and altered themselves over time, but for most cases it is a rank bestowed upon those who preside over the priests, deacons, and church leaders of a large metropolitan area, similar to that of a governor in scope, but more important. Often, an archbishop can even be responsible for an entire country. We can take from this that the archbishop may have been the foremost human religious authority in Carim and had at least one apostle. Apostles obviously have connections to Jesus and his downfall, but the responsibility of an apostle eventually melded themselves into that of a missionary. This may have been Morn's duty to spread the word of his gods, one of which would possibly have been Caitha. Interestingly, the miracle itself is a tale of the deaths surrounding Caitha. Now, if the red tearstone rings were crafted from the tears of this goddess, triggered by the death of the undeserving, it makes me believe that Caitha may have been exploited for her abilities. Think about this. What is an undeserved death? In my interpretation, I would say an example would be human sacrifice. If Caitha wept over the undeserving dead, which in turn created rings of power, it would not surprise me to find out that many were sent to their deaths in order to supply these rings to warriors who required a little more than usual to complete dangerous missions. What we also have is the miracle Tears of Denial. The description reads, "Miracle taught by Morn, the Archbishop's apostle. Grants one chance to endure when HP reaches 0. Intended to grant the dying a few moments for a final farewell. Tears are shed for the sake of the living, more so than the deceased." This miracle doesn't offer us too much in the way of explanation, but what we can say is since the motif of tears of power pretty much exclusively relates to Caitha, this power to keep someone from dying, albeit for a moment, gives us some insight into the goddess and the power that she has at hand. Bigger Boss, someone from my Discord, came up with the idea that the miracle might be indicative of a ritual-like sacrifice of one member of a larger family, with the miracle, Tears of Denial, allowing time for the forsaken family member to say their final goodbyes. With that, we will now be moving on to discussing Morn, one of the most integral characters to understanding Carim as a whole. Morn's set, a heavy armor set, gives us considerable insight and an introduction into both the man and Carim itself. The description of the helmet reads, "Unusual helm bestowed upon knights of Carim. Modelled on Morn, the Archbishop's apostle, the helm is of perfect likeness to the stone heads lining the cathedral. A Carim knight will dedicate an entire career to attending a single maiden, just as Morn once served the goddess alone. While the description mentions the armor being modelled on Morn, I don't think that this means that Morn had the head of a dragon or a bird. You can believe that if you want, but right now let's put that to one side. This set of armor, as we can read about, was given to the Knights of Carim. This establishes the confirmation that knighthood and chivalry did exist in Carim along with complex smithing. This may seem unimportant to some, but these elements are signs of an established society, something that not all civilizations share. The design of the Morn helmet is actually possibly inspired by the real-world helmet of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, one of his many wonderfully elaborate pieces of armor. It is very interesting to note the existence of a cathedral in Carim, and that there were stone heads very similar to the helmet within. It is great that FromSoft gives us a very distinct visual image of this cathedral that we can envisage, and helps us understand the importance and reverence that these knights had in Carim. The last line is, again, fascinating. This revealed that it is the inherited duty of a Carim knight to attend and escort a maiden is a fantastic insight into understanding Carim as a kingdom. The fact that this system of knighthood is modelled around the life and times of Morn really goes to show the influence that this apostle had, acting as both an apostle for the church and a medium between Cather and Carim. This will be of special significance later when we discuss the relationship between Aegon and Irina of Carim. The gauntlets and leggings of the set have a special line in the description that is absent from those of the helm and armour, which reads, "Modelled on Morn, the Archbishop's apostle, cast from a unique mineral resembling stone." The question that we instantly get from this is just as instantly answered. What is the unique material? In my opinion, it is probably titanite. A set of black armor forged of pure titanite is a very cool design decision, and the amount required to make a set like this is indicative of just how much these knights were valued by Carim. Next up is Morn's ring. The description reads, "A malformed ring given to knights of Carim. Boosts miracles. Morn served the goddess Cather and later became an apostle of the Archbishop. They labored together to provide comfort to the suffering." There are several interesting factors to this item. Firstly, it boosts miracles. What use would a knight have for this, other than the fact that they know and actively use miracles themselves? This would lead one to the conclusion that the knights were the ones being taught Cather's miracles by Morn. A Carim knight's mastery of combat and miracles, all while donning the impressive and very strong black armor set, would have made them a sight to behold on the battlefield. The ring also helps us develop an understanding of Morn's timeline, and how he started as a follower of Cather before becoming an apostle for the Archbishop. While it is unclear whether this labour to provide comfort was done with Cather or with Archbishop is unclear, but it does at least paint Morn as an important and possibly philanthropic figure. Even more interesting is where Morn's ring is found. It is located at the Road of Sacrifices in a slight outcropping on a dead body. Next to the location of the ring is another corpse which contains the Braille Divine Tome of Carim, a holy book filled with miracles. The fact that this tome is found next to the ring of a knight makes me believe that Aegon and Irina were not the first knight-maiden pair to travel to Lothric, and were met with a deathly end at the hands of the Corvians or otherwise. The next item related to Aegon is Morn's Great Hammer, which seems to be issued to some, but perhaps not all Carim knights. The description reads, "Great Hammer bestowed upon Carim knights who demonstrate outstanding strength and unwavering faith. Decorated by a warding charm of Carim Temple and imbued with a twisted rage of Apostle Morn." This elegantly designed weapon was given to knights with both strong of body and committed to the faiths of Carim. It is interesting that they are adorned by a warding charm. Warding charms are quite common in Japanese and Buddhist folklore, and are given to travellers who require luck or good fortune. One of these tried and tested knights was Aegon, who we'll be discussing after the next item. The Moaning Shield is Aegon's shield of choice, specially made for him by the armourers of Carim. The description reads, "A deformed great shield given to Aegon of Carim upon being conferred knighthood. The giant woman's face that protects Aegon is that of his sister, some years his senior. Skill is moan. Offer a gentle prayer to the shield, causing the woman's face to give out a low moan and attract enemies." This shows to us that if one was worthy enough to be given the title of a Carim knight, special pieces of armour or weaponry would be crafted in their honour. We learn from this that Aegon has an older sister. Whether she is alive or dead is unknown, but this familial bond is obviously something that Aegon finds comfort in. The art is unique to this shield, causing it to emit a low moan that attracts enemies to you. I wish we knew more about this person, but it is impossible to say. Could be Aegon's sister have been a maiden as well? That's up to you to decide. Aegon is our one example of a Carim knight from Morn's order in the Dark Souls series. His maiden, whether she was forced upon him or not, is Irina. Aegon is a terrific character because he is an insight into the frustration and conflict that a knight with duty may experience. On the surface, he appears as a surly and dismissive brute, but regardless of what he thinks of Irina, he will protect her and honor her choice to become a firekeeper. When analyzing Aegon and Irina, we have to remember that the Order of Knights was created in Morn's image. The relationship between a knight and his maiden is there to mirror the relationship that Morn had to Cather. Cather is a figure who, regardless of how benevolent she may seem, strengthens dark sorceries, which in turn makes her stand opposed to the linking of the First Flame, the source of power for old gods of Lordran. The concept of a firekeeper is then a threat to Cather and perhaps the religious structure of Carim as a whole. This information will help us understand Aegon's actions and his inner conflict a little better. As much as I would like to make this a dedicated video on Aegon and Irina, I will attempt to keep this contained. I won't be going line by line in his dialogue, but rather picking out the parts that I believe tell us the most about Carim. When we first encounter Aegon, he is sitting not far from the undead settlement, outside of a cell that contains Irina. He waits as a loyal, if not frustrated, protector. After talking with Irina, Aegon will have new dialogue, saying,
Taken an interest in her, have you? Well, she's a lost cause. Couldn't even become a firekeeper. After I brought her all this way and got her all ready. She's beyond repair, I tell you.
I believe when Aegon says she's a lost cause, I don't think he is referring to her failure to become a firekeeper. I interpret couldn't even become a firekeeper as a stab at Irina, implying that she couldn't even do a job as lowly as a firekeeper. We will get to Carim's attitude towards firekeeping shortly. Maidens or saints, or nuns in Irina's case, rely on this knowledge of miracles as an indication of their strength. Aegon is clearly annoyed at this fact, as she should be protecting him with miracles as much as he is protecting her with his hammer. I don't think that Irina was imprisoned per se, but that she was put there by Aegon for her own protection. Maybe he just needed a rest. It's difficult to say. What we can say though is once you take her out of her cell and she travels to Firelink Shrine, Aegon doesn't even thank you for taking her off his hands. Instead, he says,
I'm sick of looking after her at any rate. I am Aegon, a knight of Carim. I am allied to you for as long as you assure the girl's safety. And only for that long.
This is an interesting factor of Aegon. He says himself that he is fed up with looking after Irina, yet her protection is still one of his priorities. Regardless of his tired attitude when it comes to Irina, he remembers his duty. He is sworn to her for his entire career and must make sure she stays safe. For a knight of Carim to return to his homeland without his maiden would be a shameful display, to say the least. Later, you can find Aegon in Firelink Shrine, and his opinion of the game's hub makes both his and Carim's viewpoint on firekeeping and prophecies of old crystal clear. Add onto this that he has no time or respect for the unkindled in general. This is what he says.
I know you. Been some time. I just dropped in to see how she's getting on. Now, what are you playing at with this circus? This cesspool of doddering old folk and degenerates? Couldn't be better. She must fit in perfectly here.
The fact that Aegon equates Irina with old folk and degenerates helps us to understand why this surly knight looks down upon Irina. Carim seems to be quite pragmatic when it comes to investing oneself in certain pursuits, whatever they may be, whether it is knighthood or mastering miracles or otherwise. They have no time for champions of ash or otherwise. Unfortunately for Irina, it doesn't really seem to be her fault that she wants to become a firekeeper. The feelings that she describes in her dialogue regarding the dark biting at her makes me believe that these sensations are indicative of her being chosen to be a firekeeper, despite Aegon's protests. Interestingly, Aegon does seem to respect his maiden's decision to train as a firekeeper, as he will kidnap her from you if you start using her to purchase dark sorceries, as this will lead her off of her chosen path. Egon will encounter you after this, which shows his true colours, his valiant colours, as someone who genuinely does care for Irina's well-being. He says,
I made myself very clear. My allegiance remained only as long as you assured the girl's safety. This knight of Carim does not forgive betrayal. Even a broken woman deserves her dignity.
Egon's hate for betrayal extends to himself, which is why he will not betray his maiden or abandon her regardless of her choices. At the end of the day, he does care, which is what makes him such a varied and interesting character. A knight of Carim remembers his duty no matter what. He even utters his maiden's name as he dies.
Irina. This bastard.
Let us now look at Irina herself and see what we can find out about Carim. One thing that we must clear up is to understand what Irina's frailty is. Egon mentions it several times, and Irina is referred to as frail in her ashes and in her talisman. I don't think the frailty is in reference to her blindness, as that seems to be a common element among maidens. I say this because the description of the Braille Divine Tome of Carim, which reads, "In the way of white, there is a tradition on placing great faith in the words of the blind, and Braille tomes are not unusual." Blindness among teachers of spells is therefore valued instead of scorned. Another possibility would be that the frailty is more literal. We never actually see Irina standing up on her own. She is always sitting down or slumped on the floor. She could be paralyzed. While difficult to confirm, it is a possibility all the same. This would no doubt be a factor that would have added to Aegon's frustration if it were the case. When we first meet Irina, she says to us that,
"Who is there? Is someone there? Anyone? Oh, please, whoever you are, touch me. The dark surrounds me, nibbles at my flesh. Little creatures, they never stop biting. So please, hold out your hand and touch me."
These sensations that Irina feels are perhaps indicative of her predisposition for becoming a firekeeper. It's not really her fault that her path is to become a firekeeper, if she can feel the pull of the dark as she describes. She goes on to say,
"Oh, forgive me. I am Irina of Carim. I came to this land so that I might be a firekeeper. Your touch has freed me from the darkness. You are a champion, then. I am weak and unfit to tend the flames."
We can surmise from this point that her pilgrimage to Lothric was to become a firekeeper, but she feels that she is not strong enough for such a burden. This is probably why Egon fears that Irina having to deal with dark sorceries will continue to corrupt her. Another interesting line of Irina's is when she says,
"Don't worry about me. I have long dealt in dark. It is my calling."
This seems to be a very odd and deliberate choice of words from Irina. This harks back to Caitha's connection to the dark, and that Carim's religious overtones are not exclusively rooted in divine miracles. When talking to her at Firelink Shrine, she says,
"Oh, champion of Ash, welcome back. I was not meant to be a firekeeper, but I am honored to serve you beside the bonfire."
There are two ways that we can interpret her line regarding whether or not she was meant to become a firekeeper. On one hand, we can interpret it in the same way that one would say it was not meant to be, as in the maiden failed to succeed in her journey. On the other hand, however, she may be telling us that she was not meant to be a firekeeper, as in she was meant to undertake something else but chose not to. It is difficult to say for sure. Irina is quite submissive and will accept any tomes that you give her, albeit her questline outcome will change as she is slowly consumed by the darkness within her. Egon wants to prevent this from happening and has even promised to kill Irina should she fall too deeply to the darkness. The fact of the matter is that Irina was born to be a firekeeper. She was. The firekeeper's soul description from Dark Souls 1 reads, "A firekeeper's soul is a draw for humanity, and held within their bosoms, below just a thin layer of skin, are swarms of humanity that writhe and squirm." These swarms are what I think Irina is referring to when she mentions the little things that nip and bite at her. While Egon sees the path of a firekeeper as a pointless one, it is honestly her fate to become a firekeeper regardless of what others may think. More curious is the description of Irina's ashes, which read, "Irina was a frail woman. This frailty led to her becoming a saint of Carim and to her grand treachery." It seems that Irina is called a nun, a saint, and a maiden interchangeably, so it is difficult to set on just one name. More interestingly is the grand treachery referenced. I was talking with Bigger Boss, a regular on the Discord server, which opened my eyes to many possibilities. Firstly, he said that this grand treachery could have been Irina's decision to pursue the act of firekeeping, abandoning her previously set goal of being a teacher of miracles. Something else we discussed was the reality that not all maidens of Carim set out to become firekeepers. We know that miracles play a large role in the lives of these maidens, as the Braille Tome of Carim is found next to the corpse of a possible knight of Carim. Another curious example is that a maiden set is found in the ground floor sludge of the Cathedral of the Deep, in close proximity to the Drang set. Perhaps Drang Lake had sent travelling maidens out into Lothric as well. Anyway, thanks goes to Bigger Boss and everyone else on the Discord server who helped me out with some of these theories. I might revisit Egon and Irina at some point in the future, but I think we've garnered the most important elements from their relationship and Carim as a whole. Next, we will be discussing a very interesting yet elusive character, Sir Arstor, Earl of Carim. Firstly, let's discuss his titles. Sir implies knighthood bestowed by a monarch or equivalent. Does this mean that he was a knight of Carim once, similar to Egon? Let's look a bit deeper. Earl is a slightly antiquated term for a member of nobility, often someone who presides over a territory, sometimes in his king's stead. The title was, for most intents and purposes, replaced by the title of Duke or Count in the later Middle Ages. These territories that the Earls watched over were often smaller than the entire nation, which could mean that Carim may just be a small chunk of a much larger nation, but that is difficult to completely validate. Regardless of this, Sir Arstor seemed to be a very skilled inventor and weaponsmith and created several items, some of which are viewed as unnatural. Let's have a look at some of these and see what we can find out. The purging stone is a very curious item, which brings back the concept of human sacrifice into focus. The item has a description that reads, "Ash-coloured stone encasing a skull. Secret treasure of Arstor, the Earl of Carim. Reduces curse build-up and breaks curse. Humans are helpless against curses and can only redirect their influence. The purging stone does not dispel curses, but receives them as a surrogate. The stone itself was once a person or some other being." As we can see, the stone comes from Astor, and seems to, at least temporarily, break the undead curse. The description is quick to clarify, however, stating that the curse can only be redirected. If someone is suffering from a curse, it can be redirected into the stone and nullified. However, the stone itself might have once been a human being. One then seems to jump to the conclusion that this stone acts as a prison of sorts for some poor soul being fed curses so they do not affect another. Definitely not a positive start for Sir Astor. An interesting caveat to this is that the curse-rotted greatwood was likewise a vessel for curses until it grew out of control and became a monster. Sir Astor has a connection to this tree, but we will get to this later. Another thing to note as we move forward is that the same skull-like image from the purging stone finds its way into the design of the bite rings, which Astor is also responsible for. Now, what are the bite rings, you ask? I'm sure most of us have encountered them on our travels, but what are they actually? Like the tear stone rings, they appear in all three games, so let's have a look at the descriptions of each one. In Dark Souls 1, it is stated, "One of the infamous bite rings commissioned by Sir Arstor of Carim. Despite the dreadful rumours surrounding its creation, this ring is an unmistakable asset in its ability to help prevent curses." Now, it does say that the ring was commissioned by Sir Arstor, which may have meant that he required someone else to aid in its creation. What is interesting is that its creation is surrounded in dreadful rumors. What I think this could mean is, like the purging stone, a soul has been trapped within the ring, acting as a surrogate for curses. Interestingly, the ring is found in the New Londo ruins, which could possibly mean that these rings far predate the chosen undead's journey into the world of Lordaeron. Let's have a look at the Dark Souls 2 description, which reads, "One of the several bite rings, known for their peculiar design, increases curse resistance. The similar, oddly disturbing design of these rings suggests a common source. Whoever the master craftsman was, he clearly knew his trade." This description mostly reiterates what has been said before, but one element that is unique is at the mention of this common source. The common source being people in all the bite rings? This would be quite a disturbing revelation, given just how many bite rings there are available in the series. Sir Astor begins to seem more and more like Seath, a mad member of the nobility exploiting the common folk to create weapons and items. The ring is sold by Cromwell the Pardoner, a servant of Velka, but we will get to him soon enough. The description of the ring in Dark Souls 3 reads, "One of the bite rings native to Carim. Increases curse resistance. The crafting of these rings is forbidden, perhaps owing to a fear of malleable stone. Clerics, however, dabble freely in this art." This may explain who actually made the rings, after Astor had provided the design and concept. It seems that while these rules existed in Carim to prevent these sorts of rings from being made, clerics seem to have no problem with their forging. Interestingly, some of the clerics we meet in the series, particularly Petrus, Ray's bodyguard, seem to have an air of corruption amongst them. It comes as no surprise that Carim clerics may have acted similarly. Now, the descriptions of the remaining bite rings, which includes the blood bite, flesh bite, and poison bite rings, all have the same description format as the curse bite ring, but with each respective resistance being switched out for the one that it's being resistant for. It's a pity, since we would have been, privy to some interesting information from each ring, but there isn't much we can do about that. Something that we will be talking about in the next video is the fact that Cromwell and Oswald, pardoners of Velka, sell these rings. Last but not least, we have the Shotel and Astor's spear. The Shotel was created by Astor himself, while the spear was only favoured by him, which implies that he did not forge it himself. The Shotel, a sickle-shaped blade, appears in each game, so let's have a look at the descriptions. Firstly, from Dark Souls 1, it reads, "Curved sword with sharply curved blade. Created by Astor, Earl of Carim. Requires great skill to wield, but evades shield defense into sneak-in damage." I've spoken about the design and usage of the Shotel before in my Karthus video, but the fact that this weapon is usually reserved for use in North African/Middle Eastern nations is an interesting factor. It shows that Astor was well-travelled and knew his craft. The Dark Souls 2 and 3 descriptions of the Shotels don't offer us much more, other than Astor is described as a true craftsman, and that the Shotel was a favoured weapon of the tragic embraced knight, who we know as Lord Trek. We will be covering him as well in the next video. Last but not least, we have Astor's spear. It is a thrusting weapon, which is transposed for the soul of the curse-rotted Greatwood, and has a description that reads, "One of the curses that festered within the belly of the Greatwood, and a terrible weapon favoured by Earl Astor the Impaler. The spear is enwreathed in rotten, heavily poisonous meat. Defeating foes restores HP. At some point, it seems possible that the knight Astor may have travelled to the undead settlement in order to find another vessel for curses, and found the curse-rotted Greatwood, sticking his spear into the monster, but it was devoured, possibly along with him. His title of Impaler also creates the impression that he was quite brutal on the field of battle, sapping the life out of his enemies for his own strength." I think that's about all we have time for this episode. I still want to talk about Marvelous Chester, Lord Trek, Oswald, Cromwell, and Fina, but that will have to wait, as I like to keep my videos semi-consistent in length. If you would like to contribute or help me out with these videos, I will put an invite to my Discord server in the description below, and we can have a chat. If it expires but you still want to get in, just message me and I'll send you a new code. As always, thank you for listening and have a lovely day, afternoon, or night.